It began with a single tweet. One short, seemingly harmless comment on social media. That's all it took to spark what would soon become one of the most unexpected confrontations in modern celebrity history. Robert Downey Jr., the beloved Iron Man, Hollywood's phoenix who rose from ashes of addiction to stand, tall as a symbol of redemption, had always kept his distance from political flame wars. He wasn't the kind to bark back at controversy. But on that particular morning, something shifted. The world woke up to a storm, both literal and metaphorical, as headlines blazed across every major media outlet. Robert Downey Jr. calls out Trump in explosive tweet. The message was simple but laced with razor-sharp meaning. Power doesn't excuse disrespect. Real heroes lead with empathy, not ego. Enough said. No name was mentioned, but it didn't need to be. Everyone knew who it was directed at. Within hours, Donald Trump, never one to let anything slide, especially not from a Hollywood A-lister, responded with his signature bravado. Washed-up actor trying to stay relevant. Maybe try acting instead of preaching, Robert. The internet erupted. Fans took sides. The hashtags #Team Downey and Trump vs Iron Man trended globally. Memes flooded in. News channels dissected every syllable. Twitter became a war zone. But the truth, the real story, wasn't in the tweets or the talk shows. It was hidden beneath the surface, rooted in years of silent frustrations, hidden wounds, and a rare moment when two giants from different worlds dared to confront each other face to face. What the world didn't know was that the clash wasn't just digital. No, it escalated beyond that. It became personal. And then unexpectedly transformational. It all started a week before the tweet. Robert had been visiting a youth rehabilitation center in New York. A young boy, no older than 13, had asked him something innocent, something sincere. "Mr. Stark, why do powerful people never say sorry when they hurt others?" The question hit Robert like a punch to the gut. He smiled gently, but the words lingered in his mind long after he left. That night, scrolling through his feed, he saw a clip of Trump mocking a journalist at a rally, and for some reason it struck a nerve. That tweet wasn't planned. It wasn't PR strategy. It was raw emotion, frustration, empathy, and maybe a bit of his own pain. But he never expected what came next. Within 24 hours, his publicist was in panic mode. Studios were concerned. Sponsors were uneasy. And then came the phone call, a direct one. "Robert," the voice said, "the former president wants to meet." "In person." Silence. Robert leaned back, unsure if it was a joke. It wasn't. "He thinks it'll settle the buzz. You in?" He didn't answer immediately. Part of him wanted to reject the idea outright. What good would it do? But then he thought about that kid, about what it means to be a real hero. He agreed. They met at a private estate outside Manhattan, neutral ground. No press, no assistants, no cameras. Just the two of them. It started cordial. Handshake, forced smiles, a table between them. But the moment they sat, the air grew thick with tension. Trump spoke first. "So, Tony Stark has something to say to me?" Robert smiled, but it wasn't warm. "No, Robert Downey Jr. does." Trump leaned back. "Same difference." "No," Robert said firmly. "Not even close." For the next hour, words were exchanged, sharp, unapologetic, and cutting. Robert spoke about responsibility, about influence, about how words from a leader can either heal or divide. Trump, in return, accused him of hypocrisy, of living in a fantasy world, of speaking from a place of privilege without understanding real politics. Voices were raised, fingers pointed. At one point, it looked like someone might actually throw a punch. But then, something changed. Trump, leaning forward, said something that no one expected. "You think you're the only one who's been broken?" Robert froze. Trump continued, his voice unusually calm. "You talk about redemption like you own it. I've been vilified, hated, torn apart, maybe for good reason. But you think I don't lie awake at night thinking about what I could have done differently?" The room went quiet. For a moment, the Iron Man saw something different. Not the caricature the world mocked or worshipped. Not the politician or the mogul, just a man flawed, tired, searching. And in that moment, something cracked. Robert spoke, not as a celebrity, not as an activist, but as a human being. "Then why not show that side? Why hide it behind walls and fire?" Trump didn't answer, but his silence said enough. The rest of the evening passed in a strange quiet. Not friendly, not hostile, just real. By the time they left, nothing had been resolved. No public statements, no apologies, But something had shifted. A week later, Robert received a package. Inside was a simple note. Sometimes it takes iron to break the shell. DT. Alongside it, a small donation slip, $2 million to the same youth rehab center Robert had visited. No tweet, no press release, just action. Robert never responded publicly. But in his next interview, when asked about the feud, he smiled and said, "Sometimes people surprise you." The host chuckled, pressing further. "So, no hard feelings?" Robert leaned in, eyes thoughtful. "We're all playing characters one way or another. But beneath it, if we're brave enough to listen, we all want the same thing. To matter, to be heard, and maybe, to be understood." The world never saw what happened behind closed doors. They only saw the tweets, the trends, the headlines. But beneath it all, there was a different kind of story. Not about war, but about walls breaking. About two men, both idolized, both criticized, standing at opposite ends of the world, yet somehow meeting in the middle, and maybe, just maybe, proving that redemption isn't just a Hollywood tale, it's a human one. The media didn't let up, of course. They never do. Speculation continued to swirl as the public tried to piece together the truth behind the unexpected silence. Pundits debated every facial expression, every word that either Robert or Trump had said since the infamous tweets. Conspiracy theories bloomed like wildfire, some claiming there was a secret deal, others suggesting they had fought physically and settled it with fists. But neither man fed the flames. Instead, something unspoken began to shift, not between them directly, but within themselves. Robert Downey Jr., for all his showmanship on screen, had never been one to thrive on conflict in real life. His battles were internal, quiet, and deeply personal. He had fought for his life in the darkness of addiction. He had clawed his way back into the hearts of millions. And yet here he was again, pushed into another war, this time of perception, morality, and influence. But this time he chose a different weapon, empathy. A week after receiving Trump's silent donation note, Robert showed up again at the youth rehab center. Cameras tried to follow, but he slipped in unnoticed. Inside, the room was filled with kids, some broken, some hopeful, all hungry for truth. He didn't give a speech. He sat down on the floor with them, listened to their stories, and shared some of his own, not as a star, but as a survivor. When one boy asked him about the fight with the ex-president, Robert smiled. "You know," he said, "sometimes a fight isn't about who's right. Sometimes it's about what we're afraid of." The boy looked confused. "But weren't you angry?" "Yeah," Robert admitted. "But I wasn't just angry at him. I was angry at the world, at how it's easy to hate and hard to understand, at myself maybe for staying silent too long. But then I saw something in him. Not a president, not a billionaire, just a man who'd been hurt and had no idea how to show it." Those words found their way to the media eventually, of course. But surprisingly, they didn't spark another fire. In fact, for once, the world paused. Meanwhile, on the other side of that silent war, Donald Trump was wrestling with something unfamiliar: reflection. He wasn't used to being challenged in a way that didn't end in a power struggle or a press frenzy. Robert had gotten under his skin, but not because of what he said. Rather because of what he didn't. No victory lap, no follow-up jabs, just quiet understanding. It unsettled him more than any insult ever could. Late one night, he sat alone in his Mar-a-Lago office, rewatching a clip from Iron Man 3. It was the scene where Tony Stark admits, "You can take away my house, all my tricks and toys. One thing you can't take away, I am Iron Man." There was something in that delivery, something deeper than the superhero swagger. It was the voice of a man who had lost everything and still chose to stand tall. Trump paused the video, stared at the screen, and whispered to no one in particular, "Maybe there's more to him than the suit." The very next morning, Trump made a rare, brief appearance at a veterans' mental health awareness event. Cameras rolled as he walked to the podium, adjusted the mic, and unexpectedly set aside his usual bravado. "I've made mistakes," he began, surprising even his closest advisors. "But leadership isn't about pretending to be perfect. It's about learning when you're not." The room fell silent. He didn't mention Robert by name, but everyone knew. Back in Los Angeles, Robert saw the clip on his phone during a break on set. He stared at the screen, eyebrows raised, then slowly nodded to himself. Maybe the impossible wasn't so impossible after all. A few days later, their paths crossed again, but this time not in private. They were both invited to speak at a charity gala for children. Affected by drug addiction, a cause close to Robert's heart, and surprisingly now on Trump's philanthropic radar, Robert arrived first. He wore a simple black suit, his signature tinted glasses, and a quiet confidence. The press buzzed around him, but he kept his words minimal, his focus clear. Trump arrived moments later, flanked by his usual security, but there was a different air about him, less defiant, more composed. When their eyes met across the room, there was no tension, no bravado. Just a respectful nod. When it came time for speeches, the host made a last-minute decision, one that no one saw coming. Tonight we're honored to be joined by two very different men, both of whom have the power to influence millions. Please welcome together Robert Downey Jr. and Donald Trump. Gasps echoed across the room. Cameras whirred to life. The internet began its countdown. Robert stood first, then turned toward Trump with an open hand. Trump hesitated just a second, then took it. They walked side by side onto the stage. The applause was hesitant at first, then grew into something thunderous. Robert stepped to the microphone. He didn't prepare a speech, but he didn't need one. "There's a reason we're both here," he began. "Addiction, recovery, pain, these things don't care who you voted for. They don't care about politics or profits. They just hurt, and we all deal with them differently. I used to hide. Then I used to fight. Now, I try to understand." He turned to Trump, who nodded once. Trump took the mic. "I've been known to say the wrong thing loudly a lot. But one thing I've learned is that leadership is about more than being heard. It's about listening. Even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable." He paused. "And believe it or not, I listened to this man. And I heard more than a celebrity. I heard someone who's walked through fire." There was a long silence. Then Robert reached into his jacket and pulled out something small. A coin. A recovery chip. "I was given this by a kid," he said, holding it up. He said it reminded him that no one is too far gone to find their way back. "I think it's time we all remembered that." He handed it to Trump. Trump looked at it, then at Robert, and for once, he didn't have anything clever to say. He just nodded. The gala ended with a standing ovation, not because the crowd agreed with both men, but because they saw something rare: unity, vulnerability, respect. And the story didn't end there. Over the next few months, quiet collaborations began. Trump's foundation made additional donations to recovery centers. Robert launched a campaign to promote empathy-based dialogue in politics, entertainment, and education. And though they never became close friends, they stayed in touch, occasionally exchanging messages, occasionally sending quiet encouragements. When a reporter finally caught up with Robert months later and asked what he truly thought of Donald Trump now, Robert paused, thought carefully, and replied, "I think he's a complicated man. Like most of us, I still disagree with a lot of what he's done and said. But I also think we both saw each other, and sometimes that's where change starts." The reporter laughed awkwardly. "So, Iron Man and Trump, are you saying you're allies now?" Robert grinned. "No, I'm saying we're human." After that gala, the online world didn't know what to make of it. Comment sections were divided. Some hailed it as a brave moment of healing. Others mocked it as a publicity stunt. But for Robert Downey Jr., the noise didn't matter anymore. He had found clarity in chaos, and that he knew was rarer than fame. The change in him wasn't sudden, but it was steady. His interviews took on a new tone, less about red carpets and more about redemptive paths. When asked about fame, he said, "It's a spotlight. But the real question is, what are you choosing to illuminate?" Trump, too, surprised people. While he didn't undergo a public reinvention, those close to him noticed a shift: fewer outbursts, more pauses before speaking, and, perhaps most shockingly, a visible effort to listen when challenged. He wasn't perfect, not even close, but something had undoubtedly settled inside him. A reflection, maybe, or just the knowledge that not all opponents have to be enemies. The media slowly moved on. The world had other things to obsess over, but those who paid close attention noticed something rare and quiet happening. Two icons from opposite ends of the cultural spectrum had cracked open a door that most people never even knew existed. Then came the documentary. It started as a small project, a young independent filmmaker, inspired by the viral moments of the gala and the rumors of a private meeting between Robert and Trump. pitched the idea. A film not about politics, not about Hollywood, but about reconciliation. To everyone's shock, both men agreed to be interviewed. Separately. No scripts. No pre-written questions. Just raw human reflection. The film was titled Bridges and Battles, and when it premiered at a small festival in Austin, Texas, it didn't make waves. It made a tsunami. Robert's segment was filmed at sunrise, seated on a bench overlooking the Pacific. Dressed simply, no makeup, no filters, he spoke with honesty. When you're young, he said, you think power means never backing down. But as you grow, and I mean really grow, you realize that power is knowing when to stand still and just listen. He looked off at the ocean, eyes misty. I was ready to destroy him online. I was angry, self-righteous. But something inside me asked, what do you really want? To win or to understand? That question changed everything. Trump's segment, by contrast, was filmed in a quiet study, away from crowds and gold-plated curtains. He wore a navy suit but no tie. His voice was slower than usual, more measured. I've built towers, empires, won elections. But I'd never had a conversation like that one with Robert, he said, fingers tapping his knee. He didn't yell. He didn't flatter. He just stood his ground, like a man who's already lost everything once and refuses to lose himself again. He paused. I envied that. When the film ended, the theater sat in stunned silence. And then people began to applaud, not out of allegiance to either figure, but because they saw something rare, honesty. What followed was perhaps the most unexpected chapter yet. An initiative co-founded by both Robert and Trump. It was called Unlikely Unity. Its goal? To fund programs that brought together people from opposing viewpoints, backgrounds and beliefs, not to force agreement, but to teach respectful disagreement, to restore the lost art of listening. The internet didn't know how to react. Skepticism poured in, as did hope. But the results spoke louder than either. A group of ex-gang members and retired cops, sharing stories at a community center in Chicago. Young activists and veterans discussing patriotism over coffee in Philadelphia. Former addicts and corporate leaders, building rehab outreach programs in low-income neighborhoods. None of these headlines went viral, but the impact was real. And at the quiet center of it all stood two men who had once seemed destined to clash forever. Months passed. Then a year. By now, Robert was preparing for a small, indie film, his first non-blockbuster, project in over a decade. It was about a janitor in a broken city who helps a boy find his voice. No suits, no tech, just grit and grace. When asked why he chose it, he replied, because redemption stories never get old, especially the small ones. Trump, on the other hand, had begun writing a book, not a political memoir, but a reflection piece. In one leaked excerpt, he wrote, I've met kings, dictators, and billionaires, but the only man who ever made me rethink everything was a former addict in sunglasses, who played a superhero. The quote went viral, and once again the world took notice. Then came the interview. It was Oprah who brought them together, not as rivals, not as sides of a debate, just two men who had been through the fire. The studio audience was tense with anticipation. As Robert and Trump walked out, shoulder to shoulder, the applause was warm. Hesitant, confused, Oprah smiled, folded her hands, and said, let's skip the small talk. What made you decide to sit down together? Robert leaned forward. Because this isn't about us anymore. It's about what happens when people who disagree don't walk away. Trump nodded. We realized that if we could find a middle ground, maybe others could too. What changed you? Oprah asked. Robert's eyes narrowed in thought, realizing that the people we think are villains usually have stories we never bothered to hear. And you? She asked Trump. He was quiet a moment, hearing mine told back to me. By someone who didn't have to care. There was no explosive revelation. No staged reconciliation, just the quiet unraveling of years of misunderstanding and the brave stitching of something newer, stranger, and more meaningful. When the interview ended, Robert and Trump shook hands. Then, in a moment that would become iconic, Robert pulled Trump into a hug. Not performative, not staged. Just two men burdened by the weight of their pasts, who had chosen, against all odds, to lean into grace. The internet predictably had mixed reactions. But behind the noise, behind the mockery and praise, something real took root. And it began to grow. High school programs across the country picked up the Unlikely Unity curriculum. Documentaries popped up. exploring the dynamics of ideological opponents finding common ground. And every so often, quietly, Robert and Trump would appear unannounced at one of these sessions. Not as celebrities, just as examples. One day at a small town hall in Des Moines, a teenage girl asked the question everyone had been too afraid to ask. "Mr. Downey, Mr. Trump, are you friends now?" Robert looked at Trump. Trump looked at Robert. And then they both laughed. "Not in the usual sense," Robert said, "but in the important one," Trump added. The girl tilted her head. "What's that mean?" "It means," Robert said gently, "that we're on the same side of trying to make the world less angry. And that to me is a pretty solid foundation." The quiet moments after the town hall lingered in Robert's mind. As they drove away from Des Moines in separate cars, the energy of the teenager's question echoed louder than any applause. Were they friends? Not in the traditional sense. They didn't call each other on birthdays. They didn't grab dinner after speeches or exchange vacation photos. But there was a bond. Something forged not from similarity but survival. They had stood on opposite mountains, thrown rocks across the canyon, and eventually decided to build a bridge instead. Back in LA, Robert returned to the indie film set. The janitor role challenged him in a way he hadn't expected. No CGI, no quippy one-liners, just pain, purpose, and quiet resilience. He brought something to the role that the director couldn't name. But everyone felt it. A scene required him to kneel beside a boy who had just attempted to take his own life. No words, just presence. As the camera rolled, tears slipped from Robert's eyes. Not because he forced them, but because he remembered. He remembered being broken. He remembered being invisible. And he remembered the strange mercy of anyone caring enough to stay. When the director called cut, no one moved. It was as if the room had forgotten to breathe. Later in an interview, the young actor playing the boy was asked what Robert had whispered to him during the scene. He replied, he said, "You matter, even if the world forgets to tell you." That clip went viral. Again, the internet demanded to know what happened to Robert Downey Jr. Why was the once flashy, sarcastic Iron Man suddenly this deeply vulnerable man carrying the weight of the world? The answer was simple. He had met himself, not in a mirror, not in a trailer, but in a confrontation that had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with identity. His clash with Trump had become something more than political. It was spiritual. It forced him to question who he truly was when the spotlight was off. And strangely, Trump had gone through a similar transformation. In private, his staff noticed subtle changes. He asked questions during meetings instead of delivering monologues. He requested information before tweets. And most astonishingly, he began attending group discussions with former critics, listening to voices he once dismissed. Not everyone embraced this change. Some saw it as weakness. Others called it strategic rebranding. But Robert knew better. One day, Trump called him, not through an assistant, not through a PR agent, but directly. "Hey," Trump said after a long pause. "I was thinking about that time in the hotel, when we almost tore each other apart." Robert chuckled. "Hard to forget." "I was scared," Trump admitted. "Not of you, of what it meant that someone like you didn't hate me, that you were trying to understand. It messed with my head." Silence. "I think," Trump added, "that's what real power is. Not making people obey, making them think." Robert leaned back in his chair. "You finally get it." "No," Trump said. "You finally made me want to." That call stayed with Robert. He began speaking more openly about forgiveness, not as a soft virtue, but as a fierce and active choice. "Forgiveness isn't forgetting," he told a crowd in Seattle. "It's remembering and choosing not to retaliate. That's power. That's how we heal." More stories came out. Not headlines, just glimpses. Trump writing a private letter of apology to a disabled veteran he once mocked. Robert visiting a prison reform group and sitting with inmates, not as a celebrity guest, but as a fellow human being trying to understand. They never coordinated these moments, never posted about them. But somehow they kept walking parallel paths, different journeys, same direction. Then came the award. The Nobel Peace Prize Committee shocked the world when it announced a new honorary category, civic reconciliation. Through public influence, only once before had it been given, to Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk. This time it was awarded jointly to Robert Downey Jr. and Donald J. Trump. The outrage was swift. The praise, too. News outlets exploded. Debates erupted. Memes flooded the internet. But amid the noise, the two men remained quiet. Until the night of the ceremony. Held in Oslo, the room shimmered with dignity and tension. The world watched. When Robert took the stage, he wore a simple black suit, no bow tie, and a recovery chip in his pocket. He spoke softly. There was a time when I thought I had nothing left to lose. Then I realized I had never truly offered myself. Only a version, a performance. And the first time I dropped the mask was during that fight you all saw. He turned to Trump. You forced me to choose. To become a caricature of resistance or to dig deeper. I chose the second path, because I couldn't let anger define me. He stepped back. Then Trump approached the microphone. There was a murmur in the crowd, whispers of protest. But he stood tall. I've said and done things I regret. Not because the media told me to regret them, but because someone looked me in the eye and didn't flinch. Someone who could have destroyed me publicly, but didn't. He gestured toward Robert. He challenged me in a way no advisor ever did. He reminded me I'm more than my victories, that I'm still capable of growth. He paused. I don't ask you to forget what I've done, but maybe consider who I'm trying to become. The room went still. And then applause, not thunderous, but sincere. Later that night, in a small private room overlooking the Oslo skyline, Robert and Trump sat alone. No cameras, no audience, just two men who had seen the best and worst of each other. Trump raised a glass of water. To change. Robert smiled. To choosing it. They clinked glasses. Neither would ever be perfect. Robert would still be haunted by his past. Trump would still carry the weight of his. But together, they had done something almost mythic in today's world. They had laid down their weapons and picked up each other's stories. The Oslo ceremony changed many things, but not in the way the world expected. There were no overnight revolutions, no sudden shifts in ideology or political lines redrawn. But what did change was far more subtle, and perhaps far more important, the way people looked at their perceived enemies. It started in classrooms. Teachers showed clips of Robert's speech, not as part of a history lesson, but as a reflection of emotional growth, humility, and courage. Students who had spent years fighting each other over beliefs found themselves talking, really talking for the first time. Not always agreeing, but listening. In the media, pundits scrambled to adjust. The usual formats, debate, outrage. Owning the opposition suddenly felt tired, ineffective. A growing part of the audience didn't want war. They wanted nuance. They wanted growth. And surprisingly, people began demanding that from their leaders too. Trump, once a master of division, saw the irony. He had built a brand on conflict. Now the applause came only when he chose calm. At first he fought it, feeling like he was betraying himself. But then late one night in his Florida home, he turned on the TV and caught a documentary rerun, Iron Man 3. It wasn't the explosions or the suit-up sequences that struck him. It was the scene where Tony Stark, broken and stripped of all tech, admits his vulnerabilities. I am Iron Man, Stark says, and I have to own that. Trump clicked off the screen and whispered to himself, and I have to own mine. Meanwhile, Robert retreated from public life, not out of shame or exhaustion, but intention. He started mentoring young filmmakers, not for money or PR, but because he knew how lonely it could be to dream in silence. He also took on the most personal project of his life, a memoir. But it wasn't about Hollywood. It wasn't even about fame. It was called Unmasked. And it began with a single sentence. This isn't about who I was or who you think I am. It's about who I almost didn't become. The book didn't explode on charts. It simmered, quietly, powerfully. People who had grown up watching him fly as Iron Man now read his words and saw a man who had fallen harder than most, and somehow found the ground to rise from. One chapter in particular went viral, the one where he described the night he saw Trump alone backstage at a Unity event. No cameras, no script, just a former president sitting on a bench crying. Robert had walked by and paused, unsure what to do. Trump looked up, eyes red, and muttered, "They only love me when I fight." Robert sat down next to him, didn't speak, just placed a hand on his shoulder. And in that silence, something broke open in both of them. He ended the chapter with, "That night I didn't see a billionaire. I didn't see a politician. I saw a scared little boy who never learned to cry in front of anyone. And somehow I knew I had been that boy too. That vulnerability, raw, unfiltered, became a lighthouse for millions. Former rivals, broken families, divided couples, estranged parents and children. One after another, they started reaching out across the lines they once drew in blood and pride. Not everyone was ready, but some were. And that was enough to begin. 1 year later, a massive unity summit was planned. Not government-sponsored, not corporate-run, just people from all walks of life, all countries coming together in Washington, D.C. for one shared belief. That healing was harder than fighting, but worth it. Robert was invited to speak. So was Trump. There were protests, of course, accusations, skepticism, but they came anyway. As Robert stood before a crowd of nearly 200,000, he didn't use a teleprompter. No speech cards, just a folded photo in his jacket pocket, a picture of himself at 27, mugshot and all. "I don't stand here because I won," he said. "I stand here because I survived." And then chose to do something with it. He held up the photo. This was me, broken, high, lost. I had every reason to stay angry at the world, to blame everyone, but eventually I realized that real freedom isn't getting even. It's getting better. The crowd was quiet, hanging on every word. I didn't forgive Trump because I agreed with him. I forgave him because I didn't want to carry that weight anymore. I had my own burdens. He looked over at Trump, seated just off stage. And maybe, so did he. Then without warning, he stepped aside, and Trump took the mic. The air shifted, tightened. Some braced for an explosion. But what came out was softer than anyone expected. "I used to think being strong meant being right," Trump said. "Then I met a man who showed me that real strength is admitting when you're wrong." He paused. I spent decades thinking people only respected dominance. But the first time I truly felt seen was when someone didn't fear me. He glanced at Robert. He challenged me, not with insults, but with integrity, and in doing so, he saved me from the worst version of myself. Gasps in the crowd, then silence. Trump swallowed hard. "I'm still learning, still failing, still trying. But if there's one thing I've come to believe, it's this: the people we hate are sometimes the ones we don't know well enough yet." The applause was hesitant, then real, then thunderous. Two men, two symbols. Once fire and oil, now fire forged into steel. As the crowd erupted, Robert walked back to Trump. No handshake this time. Just an arm around the shoulder. No words. No need. History had spoken. The days after the Unity Summit were strangely quiet. For the first time in a long time, the media didn't know what to do. There was no scandal, no feud, no soundbite to spin. Just two men, flawed, famous, once feuding, who had stood together without flinching. And it had moved people. Not just fans, not just followers, but the quiet, cynical observers who had stopped believing change was possible. Robert returned to Malibu and spent more time with his family. He still got scripts, big ones, but he turned most down. The Iron Man in him was still loved. But the man behind the mask was finally free to be something else, something deeper. He began working on a small documentary. No budget, no studio. Just stories, real stories from real people, whose lives had been changed by the clash-turned-connection between him and Trump. One story came from a school janitor in Ohio who said, "I was ready to leave this country behind. Thought no one listened anymore. Then I saw Robert hug Trump, and I started calling my brother again after 12 years. Another from a single mother in Georgia. My son was obsessed with politics. Angry all the time. We couldn't even eat dinner without yelling. That summit? He came into my room and said, 'Mom, I think I've been fighting just to feel heard.' I'm sorry," we cried. First time in years. And then there was Trump. He stayed out of the limelight more than anyone expected. No new rallies. No cryptic tweets. No return to the stage. Instead, he started writing longhand. His staff didn't understand it. "Why not dictate?" they asked. He replied, "Because you only think when your hand slows down your mouth." He wrote to people he'd wronged. Some never replied. Others did. One letter reached a young woman whose father, Trump, had publicly shamed during his presidency. Her response read, "I still disagree with everything you stood for, but thank you for seeing the damage you caused. That alone softened something in me I didn't know needed softening. Trump kept that letter in his desk drawer. As for Robert, he was approached by a foundation offering to name a peace award after him. He declined. "If you want to honor this journey," he said, "don't give people trophies. Give them chances to try again, to be more than their worst mistake." That quote lit up the internet. In private, he still wrestled with doubt. Not everyone forgave. Not everyone cared. But one day, while walking along the Pacific coast at sunset, he was stopped by an elderly man in a wheelchair. "I hated you," the man said bluntly. "Thought you were just another Hollywood fake. All mouth, no soul." Robert nodded slowly. "Okay. But then I saw you." "Hold your tongue, stay kind. Even when the guy in front of you tried to bury you with it." The man looked out at the ocean. "Reminded me of my son. Died angry. Never forgave his father. I've always wondered if someone had just hugged them both." Robert placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "I think we're all someone's son," he said gently, "trying to find the hug we didn't get." The man teared up. So did Robert. A week later, the documentary premiered online. No red carpet, no press tour. Just a quiet upload to a streaming platform with the title, "Bridges Are Louder Than Bombs." The view count exploded. Not because it was marketed, but because it mattered. It told not just Robert and Trump's story, but the story of the people who changed because of it. A former gang leader who saw the summit behind bars and started teaching peacekeeping. A pastor and an atheist who began hosting joint listening tables. Two teens, one transgender, one evangelical, who now co-hosted a podcast called Unlikely Friends. And then came the call. The United Nations invited both Robert and Trump to speak together at a global youth conference. There was hesitation, concern, but they said yes. The speech wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't polished, but it was real. Robert opened. "When I was at my lowest, people either left or labeled me. Addict, felon, washed-up actor. But one person saw a flicker, believed I could rise. That belief changed me. So now I try to do the same for anyone, even if they wear red ties and louder suits." Laughter, then silence. "I didn't always agree with him," Robert said, gesturing toward Trump, "but we agreed on this. Every person deserves a second draft." Trump took the mic. "I've said some terrible things. I own that. But owning it doesn't erase it. It just stops the bleeding." He looked at the young faces before him. "You want to change the world? Good. Start by changing how you see your enemies, not as threats, but as teachers." The hall rose in a standing ovation. Later that night, as they rode together to the airport, Trump turned to Robert. "You know," he said with a smirk, "if someone had told me 10 years ago I'd be riding in a black SUV with Iron Man after a peace summit, I'd have laughed in their face." Robert smirked. "And if someone told me I'd end up respecting you, I'd have checked them for a fever." They both laughed. A real laugh. No cameras, no crew. Just two men who had walked through hell, met in fire, and walked out changed. When they parted ways at the terminal, they shook hands. A long, steady handshake that didn't need to be exaggerated. Robert watched Trump walk away and whispered to himself, "Stranger things have happened." Then he boarded his flight, back home, back to life. And far above the clouds, with the moonlight pouring in through the window, he reached into his coat and pulled out that old photo, his 27-year-old mugshot. He stared at it, then smiled, folded it back, and whispered, "Thank you for surviving, so I could become this." The plane flew into the night sky, leaving behind a trail of light, just like he did.